Hello, welcome to my online course, Food and Power. My name is Xaq Frohlich, and I'm an assistant research professor at KAIST University. KAIST is South Korea's flagship science and engineering university. I got my PhD in science and technology studies at MIT. My research interests focus on food and regulation. In particular, I'm working on a book on nutrition labeling and the history of the Food and Drug Administration's efforts to regulate risk in the food market. This online class is part of my Komedo Ergo Sum social media platform for research interests on the intersections of STS, or Science and Technology Studies, and food studies. Today's class is an introduction to the course and will be divided into two parts. First, I'll talk about why has food become an interesting subject now, giving an intellectual history and a material history of interest in food. And then the second part will be on the two key framing themes that I'm interested in, one being scale and space, and the other the subjective and objective dimensions of studying food. Before I start talking about the subject of how food became interesting to us, I want to ask you a simple question. What is food? Pause the video, write down your answer, and later, if you'd like, I'd be interested in reading your answers in the comment section below. I ask my students this because we often think we know what food is, but in fact, there are many other things that are edible that we put in our mouths or put into our bodies that we know are not food. And it's interesting to think about what makes something a food versus what makes it something else. For example, we often take certain special things in the form of a tablet, and we know that these are not food. We call these medicine or drugs. Other things we take in liquids forms, and we think of this as drink, but what makes something a drink or food becomes an interesting question when you start thinking about calories, for example. Some liquid things, drinks, provide us nourishment. Why is it we don't think of those as food? And then we have intermediate things, such as supplements, which aren't exactly a medicine, aren't exactly a food, but they have certain properties that we think of as being like food. They nourish us. A different question which I could ask you is, how do we know something that you eat or a food you eat is good for you? So how do we know when we eat something that it's not toxic or unhealthy or something we should not eat that is inedible? And this is an interesting problem because, again, we know if we eat some food and then hours later our body has a negative reaction, something about it wasn't good, we might make the connection. But sometimes we eat foods and years, decades later, they have a negative reaction. How do we know this? I ask this question because one thing I'm going to ask later in the course is, how do you know what you know about food or about health? Similarly, some foods we take may not be bad for our bodies, but we find them gross or disgusting. And is this cultural? Is this biological? One of the questions I want you thinking about in the class. So you may have heard this expression, food is cultural. But what does that exactly mean? What does it mean to say that food and eating is a cultural habit? And you'll have these recurring tropes, you are what you eat, or in German, man isst, was man isst, which is a play or pun on words. The French food philosopher in the 19th century, Savarin, would said, tell me what you eat and I will tell you who you are. And similarly, anthropologist Levi-Strauss talks about food being good to think with. All of these expressions play on a paradox or a double meaning in food of how food is both a material thing that we physically need. It physically becomes a part of who we are, but also food is cultural. We use it to represent something about us. It connects us to a culture or a community. To illustrate this, I want to start with first an intellectual history of how food became interesting. And the first scholars interested in food were the anthropologists. Anthropologists were interested in food for a couple of reasons, principally because food is everywhere. In the colonial period, when anthropologists went out into distant communities and started talking about what were they doing, one of the things that they saw was people eating food, and it was important to how the communities, the tribal groups, interact with each other. And it was a way to compare those dietary habits with the dietary habits they knew in Western Europe. In addition to anthropology's interest, there were specific anthropologists in the 20th century, Malinowski, later the American anthropologist Margaret Mead, who focused on food in their work, and I already mentioned Lévi-Strauss. Sociologists were also interested in food in the context of conspicuous consumption. Food played an important part in how society functioned, but in the 20th century, scholars like Pierre Bourdieu were interested in food, of how it reflected social distinction, where one's body could become a symbol of cultural capital, or food could be part of habitus, the ways that a society structured itself through everyday routines. More recently, the interest in food became of interest because of the interest in consumer cultures. So in the 1980s, scholars like Appadurai and Mary Douglas wrote books on the world of goods, interested in global commodities, also focusing on consumerism, and one of the objects that are consumed worldwide are food. And so they are interested in what food consumer cultures said about communities. And then in the 1990s, there was a growing interest in material cultures. The principal person here is Daniel Miller, and risk studies. And here the question was, how can we think of the material and risk dimensions of food and how that shapes cultural and social significances of food? And I'll say a little more in a moment about why in the 1990s this became an interest. More recently, it would be hard to talk about why food is important as an intellectual question without noticing the role of food journalism, particularly in the United States. Eric Schlosser's Fast Food Nation, and more recently Michael Pollan's book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, drew a lot of popular attention to the question of food and has been important in drawing students to food studies scholars and making food an important intellectual topic in a variety of disciplines. So this is how food became important in an intellectual history, but in a material history, there have been several events that have happened in the last 3 decades that have made food a political concern. Several, in particular, food scandals. The first food scandal, and in many ways the most important for how it's made food an important political subject, is mad cow. In the early 1990s, in Britain, there was anxiety about an unknown risk or an uncertain science about a risk, and people became concerned about whether the beef they were eating was safe, and this quickly became a global concern. It illustrated anxieties about public trust in regulatory institutions. Many of the government agencies were saying this is not a problem, but then it was discovered it was. It reflects an example of scientific uncertainty with the science of prions, and also it became an important case study in questions of public understanding of science and how do you communicate risk. A second food scandal that has gotten more international attention is that of genetically modified organisms. And it was a scandal or a debate that began in the 1990s and has continued today, in particular a debate between Europe and European countries who expressed anxiety and a lack of interest in this new technology of food, and America that was a big proponent and committed to it in its agricultural production. So this debate drew attention to questions of globalization. Would globalization be something that happens through corporations, through industrialization? And it also drew attention to what one sociologist, Ritzer, has called McDonaldization. The exportation of American industrial food ideas or technology could potentially compete with local ideas of what is safe or what is appropriate. And McDonald's itself became a symbol of this because McDonald's would open in countries abroad and this would compete with local restaurants. And so genetically modified organisms became a sort of symbol of these debates about globalization and food. And more recently, there has been a concern with obesity and the growing problems associated with overeating. Now, I put epidemic in quotations here because part of this debate and part of this most recent food scare is also a question about what is an epidemic? Who should be worrying about obesity? Is it something to be worried about? Is it in fact a problem? And so with this final food scandal, you can see a growing concern about nutrition. What are the solutions for nutritional transformations, the nutrition transition, but also a change in society in how it looks at food as going from a basic necessity to something that can become in excess a problem. So the result of these two trends in food studies has been where we are today. What Claude Fischler has described l'omnivore's dilemma. Food is interesting today because on the one hand, we have many choices, many different ways of understanding the problems in society. There's an enormous amount of interest and concern about what your food choices mean for yourself and also for society. You can see this in food labeling and lifestyle movements, vegetarianism or veganism, fair trade, my own research interest on nutrition labeling, calorie counting, or for labels such as gluten-free, which are becoming important in Europe. And all of these suggest that the consumer or the foodie or the person worried about food should be thinking about the ethical, social, and political consequences of what they eat. And one of the questions I want us to think about in this course is this new explosion of choice a luxury, a reflection of a privileged society, or is it a burden and obligation? And some of the ways we're going to talk about in the next section, how food scales and how these choices scale, and also the questions about how you study power connect up with whether the framing of choice changes the agency of individuals on this.